The Gulf War, an armed conflict between Iraq and a 42-country coalition, led by the United States. The coalition's efforts against Iraq would be carried out in two key famous phases now known today. Operation Desert Shield, which marked the military build-up from August 1990 to January 1991, and Operation Desert Storm, which began with the aerial bombing campaign against Iraq on the 17th of January 1991, and came to a close with the American-led liberation of Kuwait, on the 28th of February 1991. Throughout the Cold War, Iraq had been an ally of the Soviet Union, and there was a history of friction between Iraq and the United States. The US was concerned with Iraq's position on Israeli-Palestinian politics. The US also disliked Iraqi support for Palestinian militant groups, which led to Iraq's inclusion on the developing US list of state sponsors of terrorism, in December 1979. The US remained officially neutral after Iraq's invasion of Iran in 1980, which became the Iran-Iraq War, although it provided resources, political support, and some, non-military, aircraft to Iraq. In March 1982, Iran began a successful counter-offensive, Operation Undeniable Victory, and the US increased its support for Iraq to prevent Iran from forcing a surrender. In a US bid to open full diplomatic relations with Iraq, the country was removed from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. Ostensibly, this was because of improvement in the regime's record, although former US Assistant Defense Secretary Noel Koch later stated, "No one had any doubts about the Iraqis' continued involvement in terrorism. The real reason was to help them succeed in the war against Iran." With Iraq's newfound success in the war, and the Iranian rebuff of a peace offer in July, arms sales to Iraq reached a record spike in 1982. When Iraqi President Saddam Hussein expelled Abu Nidal to Syria at the US's request in November 1983, the Reagan administration sent Donald Rumsfeld to meet Saddam as a special envoy and to cultivate ties. By the time the ceasefire with Iran was signed in August 1988, Iraq was heavily debt-ridden and tensions within Saddam's society were rising. Most of its debt was owed to Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, and Iraq's debts to Kuwait amounted to $14 billion, with Iraq pressuring both nations to forgive the debts, but they refused. The Iraq-Kuwait border dispute involved Iraqi claims to Kuwaiti territory. Kuwait had been a part of the Ottoman Empire's province of Basra, something that Iraq claimed made Kuwait rightful Iraqi territory. Kuwait's ruling dynasty, the Al-Sabah family, had concluded a protectorate agreement in 1899 that assigned responsibility for Kuwait's foreign affairs to the United Kingdom. The UK drew the border between Kuwait and Iraq in 1922, making Iraq almost entirely landlocked, with Kuwait rejecting Iraqi attempts to secure further provisions in the region. In early July 1990, Iraq complained about Kuwait's behavior, such as not respecting their oil quotas, and openly threatened to take military action. On the 23rd of July, the CIA reported that Iraq had moved 30,000 troops to the Iraq-Kuwait border, and the US naval fleet in the Persian Gulf was placed on alert. Saddam believed an anti-Iraq conspiracy was developing. Kuwait had begun talks with Iran, and Iraq's rival Syria had arranged a visit to Egypt. On the 15th of July 1990, Saddam's government laid out its combined objections to the Arab League, including that policy moves were costing Iraq $1 billion a year, that Kuwait was still using the Rumaila oil field, and that loans made by the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait could not be considered debts to its Arab brothers. He threatened force against Kuwait and the UAE, saying, "The policies of some Arab rulers are American. They are inspired by America to undermine Arab interests and security." The US sent aerial refueling planes and combat ships to the Persian Gulf in response to these threats. Discussions in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, mediated on the Arab League's behalf by Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, were held on the 31st of July and led Mubarak to believe that a peaceful course could be established. On the 25th of July, Saddam met with April Glaspie, the US ambassador to Iraq, in Baghdad. The Iraqi leader attacked American policy with regards to Kuwait and the UAE. So what can it mean when America says it will now protect its friends? It can only mean prejudice against Iraq. This stance, plus maneuvers and statements which have been made, has encouraged the UAE and Kuwait to disregard Iraqi rights. If you use pressure, we will deploy pressure and force. We know that you can harm us, although we do not threaten you. But we too can harm you. Everyone can cause harm according to their ability and their size. We cannot come all the way to you in the United States, but individual Arabs may reach you. We do not place America among the enemies. We place it where we want our friends to be, and we try to be friends. But repeated American statements last year made it apparent that America did not regard us as friends. Gillespie replied, "I know you need funds. We understand that, and our opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country. But we have no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Frankly, we can only see that you have deployed massive troops in the south. Normally that would not be any of our business. But when this happens in the context of what you said on your National Day, then when we read the details in the 2 letters of the foreign minister, then when we see the Iraqi point of view that the measures taken by the UAE and Kuwait is, in the final analysis, parallel to military aggression against Iraq, then it would be reasonable for me to be concerned." Saddam stated that he would attempt last-ditch negotiations with the Kuwaitis, but Iraq would not accept death. On the 26th of July 1990, only a few days before the Iraqi invasion, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, officials said that Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates had agreed to a proposal to limit their oil output to 1.5 million barrels per day, down from the nearly 2 million barrels a day they had each been pumping, thus potentially settling differences over oil policy between Kuwait and Iraq. The result of the Jeddah talks was an Iraqi demand for $10 billion to cover the lost revenues from Rumaila. Kuwait offered $500 million. The Iraqi response was to immediately order an invasion, which started on the 2nd of August 1990 with the bombing of Kuwait's capital, Kuwait City. Before the invasion, the Kuwaiti military was believed to have numbered 16,000 men, arranged into 3 armored, 1 mechanized infantry and 1 understrength artillery brigade. The pre-war strength of the Kuwait Air Force was around 2,200 Kuwaiti personnel, with 80 fixed-wing aircraft and 40 helicopters. In spite of Iraqi saber-rattling, Kuwait did not mobilize its force. The army had been stood down on the 19th of July, and during the Iraqi invasion many Kuwaiti military personnel were on leave. Iraqi commandos infiltrated the Kuwaiti border first, to prepare for the major units, which began the attack at midnight. The Iraqi attack had 2 prongs, with the primary attack force driving south straight for Kuwait City down the main highway, and a supporting attack force entering Kuwait farther west, but then turning and driving east, cutting off Kuwait City from the country's southern half. The commander of a Kuwaiti armored battalion, 35th Armored Brigade, deployed them against the Iraqi attack and conducted a robust defense at the Battle of the Bridges near Al-Jarrah, west of Kuwait City. Within 12 hours, most resistance had ended within Kuwait, and the royal family had fled, allowing Iraq to control most of Kuwait. After 2 days of intense combat, most of the Kuwaiti military were either overrun by the Iraqi Republican Guard, or had escaped to Saudi Arabia. The emir and key ministers fled south along the highway for refuge in Saudi Arabia. Iraqi ground forces consolidated their control of Kuwait City, then headed south and redeployed along the Saudi border. After the decisive Iraqi victory, Saddam initially installed a puppet regime known as the Provisional Government of Free Kuwait, before installing his cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, as Kuwait's governor on the 8th of August. After the invasion, the Iraqi military looted over $1 billion in banknotes from Kuwait's central bank. At the same time, Saddam Hussein made the Kuwaiti dinar equal to the Iraqi dinar, thereby lowering the Kuwaiti currency to 1/12 of its original value. In response, Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmad al-Sabah ruled the banknotes as invalid and refused to reimburse stolen notes, which became worthless because of a UN embargo. After the conflict ended, many of the stolen banknotes made their way back into circulation. Today, the stolen banknotes are a collectible for many enthusiasts. Within hours of the invasion, Kuwait and US delegations requested a meeting of the UN Security Council, which passed Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding a withdrawal of Iraqi troops. On the 3rd of August 1990, the Arab League passed its own resolution, which called for a solution to the conflict from within the League, and warned against outside intervention. Iraq and Libya were the only 2 Arab League states that opposed the resolution for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. The Palestinian Liberation Organization or PLO opposed it as well. The Arab states of Yemen and Jordan, a Western ally which bordered Iraq and relied on the country for economic support, opposed military intervention from non-Arab states. Separately, Sudan, also an Arab League member, aligned itself with Saddam. On the 6th of August, Resolution 661 placed economic sanctions on Iraq. Resolution 665 followed soon after, which authorized a naval blockade to enforce the sanctions. It said the use of measures commensurate to the specific circumstances as may be necessary. to halt all inward and outward maritime shipping in order to inspect and verify their cargoes and destinations and to ensure strict implementation of Resolution 661. The US administration had at first been indecisive, with an undertone of resignation to the invasion and even adaptation to it as a fait accompli, until the UK's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher played a powerful role, reminding the president that appeasement in the 1930s had led to war, that Saddam would have the whole Gulf at his mercy along with 65% of the world's oil supply, and famously urging President Bush not to go wobbly. Once persuaded, US officials insisted on a total Iraqi pullout from Kuwait, without any linkage to other Middle Eastern problems, accepting the British view that any concessions would strengthen Iraqi influence in the region for years to come. On the 23rd of August, Saddam appeared on state television with Western hostages to whom he had refused exit visas. In the video, he asks a young British boy, Stuart Lockwood, whether he is getting his milk, and goes on to say, through his interpreter, "We hope your presence as guests here will not be for too long. Your presence here, and in other places, is meant to prevent the scourge of war." On the 29th of November 1990, the Security Council passed Resolution 678, which gave Iraq until the 15th of January 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait, and empowered states to use all necessary means to force Iraq out of Kuwait after the deadline. In December 1990, Iraq made a proposal to withdraw from Kuwait provided that foreign troops left the region and that an agreement was reached regarding the Palestinian problem and the dismantlement of both Israel's and Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. The White House rejected the proposal. The PLO's Yasser Arafat expressed that neither he nor Saddam insisted that solving the Israel-Palestine issue should be a precondition to solving the issues in Kuwait, though he did acknowledge a strong link between these problems. Ultimately, the US and UK stuck to their position that there would be no negotiations until Iraq withdrew from Kuwait and that they should not grant Iraq concessions, lest they give the impression that Iraq benefited from its military campaign. A coalition of forces opposing Iraq's aggression was formed, consisting of forces from 42 countries: Argentina, Australia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Egypt, France, Germany, Greece, Honduras, Hungary, Italy, Japan, Kuwait, Luxembourg, Morocco, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Niger, Norway, Oman, Pakistan, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Romania, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Syria, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom and the United States. It was the largest coalition since World War II. A group of Afghan Mujahideen soldiers also reportedly joined towards the end of the war. U.S. Army General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. was designated to be the commander of the coalition forces in the Persian Gulf area. The Soviet Union condemned Baghdad's aggression against Kuwait, but did not support the United States and Allied intervention in Iraq and tried to revert it. Many of the coalition countries were reluctant to commit military forces. Some felt that the war was an internal Arab affair or did not want to increase US influence in the Middle East. In the end, however, many governments were persuaded by Iraq's belligerence towards other Arab states, offers of economic aid or debt forgiveness, and threats to withhold aid. The Gulf War began with an extensive aerial bombing campaign on the 16th of January 1991. For 42 consecutive days and nights, the coalition forces subjected Iraq to one of the most intensive air bombardments in military history. The coalition flew over 100,000 sorties, dropping 88,500 tons of bombs, which widely destroyed military and civilian infrastructure. Iraq hoped to provoke a military response from Israel, and the Iraqi government hoped that many Arab states would withdraw from the coalition, as they would be reluctant to fight alongside Israel. Following the first attacks, Israeli Air Force jets were deployed to patrol the northern airspace with Iraq. Israel prepared to militarily retaliate, as its policy for the previous 40 years had always been retaliation. However, President Bush pressured Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir not to retaliate and withdraw Israeli jets, fearing that if Israel attacked Iraq, the other Arab states would either desert the coalition or join Iraq. It was also feared that if Israel used Syrian or Jordanian airspace to attack Iraq, they would intervene in the war on Iraq's side or attack Israel. The coalition promised to deploy Patriot missiles to defend Israel if it refrained from responding to the Scud attacks. The Scud missiles targeting Israel were relatively ineffective, as firing at extreme range resulted in a dramatic reduction in accuracy and payload. 2 Israeli civilians died as a direct result of the missile attacks. Between 11 and 74 people were killed from incorrect use of gas masks, heart attacks, and incorrect use of the anti-chemical weapons drug atropine. Approximately 230 Israelis were injured. Extensive property damage was also caused, and, according to the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, damage to general property consisted of 1,302 houses, 6,142 apartments, 23 public buildings, 200 shops and 50 cars. It was feared that Iraq would fire missiles filled with nerve agents such as sarin. As a result, Israel's government issued gas masks to its citizens. When the first Iraqi missiles hit Israel, some people injected themselves with an antidote for nerve gas. It has been suggested that the sturdy construction techniques used in Israeli cities, coupled with the fact that Scuds were only launched at night, played an important role in limiting the number of casualties from Scud attacks. Coalition air forces were also extensively exercised in Scud hunts in the Iraqi desert, trying to locate the camouflaged trucks before they fired their missiles at Israel or Saudi Arabia. On the ground, Special Operations Forces also infiltrated Iraq, tasked with locating and destroying Scuds, including the ill-fated Bravo 20 patrol of the SAS. Once special operations were combined with air patrols, the number of attacks fell sharply, then increased slightly as Iraqi forces adjusted to coalition tactics. A 90,000-round artillery preparation fire on Iraqi defensive positions preceded the major ground assault, lasting 2.5 hours. 1st Infantry Division Artillery, which included 4 to 3 FA Battalion, was decisive during artillery combat operations, performing multiple raids and fire missions. These combat operations resulted in the destruction of 50 enemy tanks, 139 APCs, 30 air defense systems, 152 artillery pieces, 27 missile launchers, 108 mortars, and 548 wheeled vehicles, 61 trench lines and bunker positions, 92 dug-in and open infantry targets, and 34 logistical sites. The ground campaign consisted of 3 or possibly 4 of the largest tank battles in American military history. The battles at 73 Easting, Norfolk, and Medina Ridge are well noted for their historical significance. Some consider the Battle of Medina Ridge the largest tank battle of the war. Other sources consider the Battle of Norfolk the largest tank battle of the war and the second largest tank battle in American history. The U.S. Marine Corps also fought the biggest tank battle in its history at Kuwait International Airport, and the U.S. 3rd Armored Division also fought a significant battle at Objective Dorset, not far from where the Battle of Norfolk was taking place, with the U.S. 3rd Armored Division destroying approximately 300 enemy combat vehicles during this particular encounter with Iraqi forces. The U.S. 7th Corps was the primary combat formation of the coalition forces. It was a formidable fighting force consisting of 1,487 tanks, 1,384 infantry fighting vehicles, 568 artillery pieces, 132 MLRS, 8 missile launchers, and 242 attack helicopters. It had a total troop strength of 146,321 troops. Its primary full-strength fighting formations were the 1st Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division. The 2nd Armored Division was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division as its 3rd Maneuver Brigade. Its Task Force 141 Infantry would be the spearhead of 7th Corps. In addition, the Corps had the 2nd Cavalry Regiment to act as a scouting and screening force, and 2 further heavy divisions, the 1st Cavalry Division and the United Kingdom's 1st Armored Division, as well as the U.S. 11th Aviation Group. 7th Corps fought a number of large battles against Iraqi forces, some of them historical in scope and size. By the end of combat operations on the 28th of February 1991, 7th Corps had driven 260 kilometers, captured 22,000 Iraqi soldiers, and destroyed 1,350 Iraqi tanks, 1,224 armored personnel carriers, 285 artillery pieces, 105 air defense systems, and 1,229 trucks. The U.S. Marine Corps was represented by the 1st Marine Division and the 2nd Marine Division. They were supported by the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Division's Tiger Brigade to provide the Marines with additional armor support. Marine armor units mostly consisted of the older M60 tank. The 1st Marine Division destroyed around 60 Iraqi tanks near the Bergen oil field without suffering any losses. The 1st Marine Division Task Force Ripper led the drive to the Kuwait International Airport on the 27th of February 1991. Marine Task Force Ripper destroyed about 100 Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carriers, including T-72 tanks. The division commander Major General J.M. Myatt said, "During the first day of combat operations, 1st Platoon, D Company, 3rd Tank Battalion destroyed 15 Iraqi tanks. The Marines also destroyed 25 APCs and took 300 prisoners of war." The USMC would often encounter the Iraqi 3rd Armored Division in their theater of operations. Once the 1st Marine Division reached Kuwait International Airport, they found what remained of the Iraqi 12th Armored Brigade, 3rd Armored Division defending it. The Marines destroyed 30 to 40 Iraqi T-72 tanks which had taken up defensive positions around the airport. The Iraqi 3rd Armored Division losses included more than 250 T-55s and 62s and 70 T-72 tanks by the end of combat operations. The Iraqi 3rd Armored Division would be totally destroyed. The 2nd Marine Division played a major role repelling the attempted Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia, which is known as the Battle of Khafji. The 2nd Marine Division also faced heavy resistance during the Battle of Kuwait International Airport, which went on to become the largest tank battle in United States Marine Corps entire history. Marine Reserve Unit Bravo Company, 4th Tank Battalion, 4th Marine Division was assigned to the 2nd Marine Division. Bravo Company destroyed a total of 119 enemy vehicles and took over 800 POWs by the end of combat operations. The 1st Tank Battalion claimed 50 Iraqi T-55 and T-62 tanks and 25 APCs. The 3rd Battalion claimed 57 T-55s and T-62s along with 5 T-72s, 7 APCs, and 10 trucks. The 8th Battalion destroyed more than 3 dozen tanks and a number of other vehicles. U.S. Marine Corps armor units would destroy hundreds of Iraqi tanks by the end of combat operations, and U.S. Marine Corps tank losses would be light as they suffered the loss of 10 M60 tanks during combat operations. U.S. decoy attacks by air attacks and naval gunfire the night before Kuwait's liberation were designed to make the Iraqis believe the main coalition ground attack would focus on central Kuwait. For months, American units in Saudi Arabia had been under almost constant Iraqi artillery fire, as well as threats from Scud missiles and chemical attacks. On the 24th of February 1991, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions and the 1st Light Armored Infantry Battalion crossed into Kuwait and headed toward Kuwait City. They encountered trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. However, these positions were poorly defended, and were overrun in the first few hours. Several tank battles took place, but otherwise coalition troops encountered minimal resistance, as most Iraqi troops surrendered. The general pattern was that the Iraqis would put up a short fight before surrendering. However, Iraqi air defenses shot down 9 U.S. aircraft. Meanwhile, forces from Arab states advanced into Kuwait from the east, encountering little resistance and suffering few casualties. Despite the successes of coalition forces, it was feared that the Iraqi Republican Guard would escape into Iraq before it could be destroyed. It was decided to send British armored forces into Kuwait 15 hours ahead of schedule, and to send U.S. forces after the Republican Guard. The coalition advance was preceded by a heavy artillery and rocket barrage, after which 150,000 troops and 1,500 tanks began their advance. Iraqi forces in Kuwait counterattacked against U.S. troops, acting on a direct order from Saddam Hussein himself. Despite the intense combat, the Americans repulsed the Iraqis and continued to advance towards Kuwait City, with Kuwaiti forces tasked with liberating the city. Iraqi troops offered only light resistance, and the Kuwaitis quickly liberated the city despite losing 1 soldier and having 1 plane shot down. On the 27th of February, Saddam ordered a retreat from Kuwait, and President Bush declared it liberated. However, an Iraqi unit at Kuwait International Airport appeared not to have received the message and fiercely resisted. U.S. Marines had to fight for hours before securing the airport, after which Kuwait was declared secure. After 4 days of fighting, Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. As part of a scorched earth policy, they set fire to nearly 700 oil wells and placed landmines around the wells to make extinguishing the fires more difficult. Shortly afterwards, the U.S. 7th Corps, in full strength and spearheaded by the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, launched an armored attack into Iraq early on the 24th of February, just to the west of Kuwait, surprising Iraqi forces. Simultaneously, the U.S. 18th Airborne Corps launched a sweeping, left-hook, attack across southern Iraq's largely undefended desert, led by the U.S. 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment and the 24th Infantry Division. This movement's left flank was protected by the French Division de Gay. The 101st Airborne Division conducted a combat air assault into enemy territory and had struck 249 kilometers behind enemy lines. It was the deepest air assault operation in history. Approximately 400 helicopters transported 2,000 soldiers into Iraq, where they destroyed Iraqi columns trying to flee westward and prevented the escape of Iraqi forces. The 101st Airborne Division traveled a further 80 to 100 kilometers into Iraq. By nightfall, the 101st cut off Highway 8, which was a vital supply line running between Basra and the Iraqi forces. The 101st had lost 16 soldiers in action during the 100-hour war and captured thousands of enemy prisoners of war. The coalition's advance was much swifter than US generals had expected. On the 26th of February, Iraqi troops began retreating from Kuwait, after they had set 737 of its oil wells on fire. A long convoy of retreating Iraqi troops formed along the main Iraq-Kuwait highway. Although they were retreating, this convoy was bombed so extensively by coalition air forces that it came to be known as the Highway of Death, where thousands of Iraqi troops were killed and American, British, and French forces continued to pursue retreating Iraqi forces over the border and back into Iraq, eventually moving to within 240 kilometers of Baghdad, before withdrawing back to Iraq's border with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. In coalition-occupied Iraqi territory, a peace conference was held where a ceasefire agreement was negotiated and signed by both sides. At the conference, Iraq was authorized to fly armed helicopters on their side of the temporary border, ostensibly for government transit due to the damage done to civilian infrastructure. Soon after, these helicopters and much of Iraq's military were used to fight an uprising in the south. On March 1, 1991, one day after the Gulf War ceasefire, a revolt broke out in Basra against the Iraqi government. The uprising spread within days to all of the largest Shia cities in southern Iraq: Najaf, Amara, Diwania, Hilla, Karbala, Kut, Nasiriyah and Samawa. The rebellions were encouraged by an airing of The Voice of Free Iraq on the 24th of February 1991, which was broadcast from a CIA-run radio station out of Saudi Arabia. The Arabic service of the Voice of America supported the uprising by stating that the rebellion was well supported, and that they would soon be liberated from Saddam. In the north, Kurdish leaders took American statements that they would support an uprising to heart, and began fighting, hoping to trigger a coup d'état. However, when no US support came, Iraqi generals remained loyal to Saddam and brutally crushed the Kurdish uprising and the uprising in the south. Millions of Kurds fled across the mountains to Turkey and Kurdish areas of Iran. On April 5, the Iraqi government announced the complete crushing of acts of sedition, sabotage and rioting in all towns of Iraq. An estimated 25,000 to 100,000 Iraqis were killed in the uprisings. These events later resulted in no-fly zones being established in northern and southern Iraq. In Kuwait, the emir was restored, and suspected Iraqi collaborators were repressed. Eventually, over 400,000 people were expelled from the country, including a large number of Palestinians, because of PLO support of Saddam. Yasser Arafat did not apologize for his support of Iraq, but after his death Mahmoud Abbas formally apologized in 2004 on behalf of the PLO. This came after the Kuwaiti government formally forgave the group. There was some criticism of the Bush administration, as they chose to allow Saddam to remain in power instead of pushing on to capture Baghdad and overthrowing his government. In their co-written 1998 book, A World Transformed, Bush and Brent Scowcroft argued that such a course would have fractured the alliance, and would have had many unnecessary political and human costs associated with it. In 1992, the US Defense Secretary during the war, Dick Cheney, made the same point. "I would guess if we had gone in there, we would still have forces in Baghdad today. We'd be running the country. We would not have been able to get everybody out and bring everybody home." And the final point that I think needs to be made is this question of casualties. I don't think you could have done all of that without significant additional US casualties. And while everybody was tremendously impressed with the low cost of the 1991 conflict, for the 146 Americans who were killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question in my mind is, how many additional American casualties is Saddam Hussein worth? And the answer is, not that damned many. So, I think we got it right, both when we decided to expel him from Kuwait, but also when the president made the decision that we'd achieved our objectives and we were not going to go get bogged down in the problems of trying to take over and govern Iraq. On the 10th of March 1991, 540,000 US troops began moving out of the Persian Gulf and the war was officially over. Many returning coalition soldiers reported illnesses following their action in the war, a phenomenon known as Gulf War syndrome or Gulf War illness. Common symptoms reported are chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and gastrointestinal disorder. There has been widespread speculation and disagreement about the causes of the illness and the possibly related birth defects. Researchers found that infants born to male veterans of the 1991 war had higher rates of two types of heart valve defects. Some children born after the war to Gulf War veterans had a certain kidney defect that was not found in those Gulf War veterans' children born before the war. Researchers have said that they did not have enough information to link birth defects with exposure to toxic substances. Since the war, the US has had a continued presence of 5,000 troops stationed in Saudi Arabia, a figure that rose to 10,000 during the 2003 conflict in Iraq. Operation Southern Watch enforced the no-fly zones over southern Iraq set up after 1991. Oil exports through the Persian Gulf shipping lanes were protected by the Bahrain-based US Fifth Fleet. Since Saudi Arabia houses Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest sites, many Muslims were upset at the permanent military presence. The continued presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia after the war was one of the stated motivations behind the 11th of September terrorist attacks, the Kobar Towers bombing, and the date chosen for the 1998 US Embassy bombings, which was 8 years to the day that US troops were sent to Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden interpreted the Islamic prophet Muhammad as banning the permanent presence of infidels in Arabia. In 1996, bin Laden issued a fatwa, calling for US troops to leave Saudi Arabia. In a December 1999 interview with Rahimullah Yousafzai, bin Laden said he felt that Americans were too near to Mecca, and considered this a provocation to the entire Islamic world. Thank you for watching the Gulf War. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss our next video.